Jason Harper tightened his grip on the steering wheel as the narrow dirt road climbed higher into the mountains of Montana. The truck's tires crunched over gravel, and the headlights cut through the dense forest. This was where he was headed, a fire lookout tower perched in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by miles of wilderness. He needed this. After the year he'd had, the idea of solitude seemed like a lifeline. His divorce from Megan had left him emotionally drained. Years of arguments and blame had worn them both down until there was nothing left to salvage. Then came the loss of his job as a paramedic. Burned out and haunted by a call he couldn't forget, he'd handed in his resignation. Time to disappear for a while, he had muttered to himself, scrolling through job boards late one night. That's when he found it, a seasonal position as a fire lookout in the Lolo National Forest. Minimal interaction with people, a small stipend, and the promise of peace. Jason parked the truck at the base of the tower. The structure loomed above him, a skeleton of steel rising into the starlit sky. A wooden staircase zigzagged to the top, where a small cabin with panoramic windows awaited. His supplies were minimal, a duffel bag, a stack of books, a journal, and enough food to last until the next resupply. The climb up the stairs was long and creaky. By the time he reached the top, his legs ached, but the view was worth it. Even in the dark, he could make out the jagged silhouettes of mountains stretching to the horizon. Inside the cabin, he found a bed, a desk, an old wood stove, and the main tool of his new trade, a two-way radio. The first contact. Jason spent his first day settling in. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the cry of a hawk. It felt good to be away from everything. That evening, as he was jotting down thoughts in his journal, the radio crackled to life. "Lookout 3, this is Lookout 7. Do you copy?" Jason froze for a moment, then grabbed the microphone. "This is 3. Go ahead." "New guy, huh? Welcome to the wilderness." "Name's Frank," the voice said, gruff but friendly. "Jason. Just got here yesterday," he replied. "Well, Jason, here's the deal, you see smoke, you report it. That's the job. But keep an eye out for other things, too." "Other things?" Jason asked, confused. "Yeah, weird stuff. Don't worry, you'll know it when you see it. And if you don't, well, you'll figure it out soon enough." Before Jason could ask what Frank meant, the radio went silent. He leaned back in his chair, staring out at the dark forest. What had Frank meant by weird stuff? That night, Jason lay awake in his narrow bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the wilderness. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Closer, branches snapped under the weight of something moving through the forest. The solitude Jason had craved now felt oppressive, as though the darkness outside was watching him. Jason woke up the next morning to sunlight streaming through the wide windows of the cabin. His sleep had been restless, the forest felt alive, noisy, and intentionally unsettling throughout the night. After sipping cold coffee from his thermos, he decided to walk the perimeter around the tower. The forest greeted him with coolness and silence. The tall, dense trees stood like silent giants. Occasionally, the wind would stir their tops, creating the illusion that they were whispering to one another. Jason tried to ignore these thoughts, focusing on surveying the area instead. By evening, he was back in the cabin, scanning the horizon through binoculars. The first day had been uneventful. But when the sun set and darkness once again enveloped the mountains, a strange tension crept in. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life. "Lookout 3, this is Lookout 7. Are you there?" Frank's voice sounded more serious now. "I'm here." "Everything's quiet," Jason replied, feeling slightly on edge. "How'd your night go? Didn't see anything strange?" Jason hesitated. The forest had been loud and, at times, felt almost hostile, but he chalked it up to wildlife. "Nothing unusual, just the sounds of the forest," he said. Frank paused, as if weighing Jason's response. All right. Just keep your eyes open. The forest here isn't always what it seems. The conversation ended, and Jason was once again left alone with his thoughts. Around midnight, Jason heard a strange noise. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but the sound grew louder. It resembled footsteps moving beneath the tower. Grabbing his flashlight, he cautiously stepped onto the balcony. The forest looked entirely different under the beam of his flashlight. Instead of calming him, the trees appeared menacing, as if they were hiding something in their shadows. Jason strained to listen. The footsteps had stopped. Suddenly, his light caught something metallic glinting on the ground a few meters from the stairs. He directed the flashlight's beam and saw a small piece of metal. Jason descended the stairs slowly, trying not to make a sound. The metallic object turned out to be an old lighter, slightly scratched but still functional. Someone was here before, he wondered. The sound came again. It was a faint rustling, as if something moved quickly between the trees. Cold sweat trickled down Jason's back. "Who's there?" he called out loudly, but there was no reply. Jason stood beneath the tower, carefully listening. The forest had fallen silent again, but this time, the silence felt oppressive. He returned to the cabin, clutching the lighter in his hand, and locked the door behind him. Sitting at the table, he examined the found object. On its side were engraved letters, TW. It offered no clues, but Frank's voice echoed in his mind, "The forest isn't always what it seems." Suddenly, the radio crackled to life. "Tower 3, this is 7. See anything interesting?" Frank's voice came through. "Found a lighter under the tower. Maybe a tourist left it," Jason replied. There was a pause on the other end. "A lighter. What does it look like?" Frank's tone shifted, now laced with unease. "Metallic, engraved with the initials TW, Jason explained. Silence. Then. "Listen, Jason, don't touch anything else. And if you see anything strange, don't leave the cabin. Just call me, okay?" Frank ended the call before Jason could respond. Jason sat with the lighter in his hands, feeling an invisible weight of anxiety settle over him. That night, the noises returned. Jason heard footsteps again, but this time, they sounded heavier, slower. The sounds weren't just coming from below, they seemed to circle the tower. Grabbing a flashlight, he cautiously peered out the window, only to see darkness. Then, something flickered in the beam of his flashlight. A human figure moved among the trees. It was tall, thin, and almost shadow-like, but unmistakably real. Jason pulled back, his heart pounding in his chest. Suddenly, the radio crackled again, but the voice wasn't Frank's. It was whispery, faint, but clear. "Don't look." Jason dropped the mic, and then he heard the footsteps ascending the stairs. Barely breathing, he crouched behind the table, curling into the darkest corner of the cabin. The footsteps stopped at the door. Silence. Then, the sharp scrape of metal, as though someone was testing the lock. When the noise at the door ceased, Jason finally worked up the courage to peek outside. No one was there, but on the threshold lay a small scrap of paper. He picked it up carefully and saw a few scrawled words. "You're next. TW." Jason grabbed the radio in a panic. "Frank, this is Jason. Something came to the tower. It's not an animal." The signal crackled, but there was no response. At dawn, Jason decided he had to leave immediately. He packed his belongings quickly, descended the tower, and got into his car. The engine roared to life, and he sped down the forest road, resisting the urge to look back. After driving a few miles, he noticed something strange. On the roadside lay the same old lighter he had found under the tower. This can't be happening, Jason thought, gripping the steering wheel nervously. His heart raced, but he refused to stop. The road stretched on, but now it seemed unfamiliar. The forest felt endless. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the middle of the road, tall, thin, and shadowy. Jason slammed on the brakes, but the figure vanished as quickly as it had appeared. When he finally emerged from the forest onto the main highway, his phone buzzed. It was Frank. "Jason. Why weren't you answering? Are you okay? What's going on, Frank? Who or what was that?" Jason's voice was almost a shout. Frank hesitated for a moment, then replied in a quiet tone. "I warned you. The forest here is strange. But you're safe now. Just don't come back." Jason never returned to that forest. But from time to time, he would wake up in the middle of the night, feeling as though someone was watching him through the window. Richard had been working on a fire lookout tower in the forests of Montana for years. His job was to monitor for potential wildfires, keep an eye on the forest, and stay in touch with nearby towers. It was a job for patient people who could handle solitude and find peace in isolation. After a tough divorce, Richard decided to take his 10-year-old son, Jake, to the forest for a few weeks. The boy had been struggling with the divorce, becoming quiet, withdrawn, and spending most of his time in his room playing games on his tablet. Richard hoped that the fresh air, the simplicity of forest life, and some father-son time would help them reconnect. Their trip began early in the morning. Richard loaded everything they would need into his pickup truck: crates of canned food, bottles of water, a generator, a few flashlights, and an old radio. Jake climbed into the truck reluctantly, clutching his backpack with a toy dinosaur and his tablet inside. "Is it going to be boring there?" Jake asked, glancing at his father. "No. The forest is a whole world of adventure," Richard replied, trying to cheer him up. They drove down a dirt road that wound through the trees. The forest grew thicker, and the trail narrower. Along the way, they passed old wooden signs marking the towers, each with a number designating a section of the forest. "Are there other people here besides us?" Jake asked, sounding a little nervous as he realized how far from civilization they were. "There are a few other towers with watchers like me. We'll stay in touch with them over the radio. But no one is near us," Richard explained. After an hour of driving, they reached the tower. It was a simple yet sturdy structure made of wood and steel. A tall ladder led up to a cabin at the top, offering a panoramic view of the forest stretching for miles in every direction. Richard unloaded the truck and started showing Jake the cabin. Inside, it was basic: a table with a map of the forest, an old chair, a bed, a tiny kitchen, and a bookshelf filled with weathered books. "This is your new home for the next 2 weeks," Richard said with a smile. Jake, now slightly intrigued, walked to the window and looked out. The view was breathtaking. While Richard unpacked their things, Jake decided to explore the cabin. His attention was drawn to an old radio. "Can I try it?" he asked. "You can, but only when I'm with you," Richard replied. That evening, after a quick dinner, the two of them sat on the cabin's roof, watching the stars. "Do you hear that?" Richard asked. "Hear what?" Jake listened closely. "The sounds of the forest. It's always talking. You just have to learn how to listen." Jake listened to the chirping of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. It felt as if the forest was alive. As night descended, the forest around them grew still. The only sound was the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind and the chirping of distant crickets. Richard had set up a small campfire outside, and they sat together, eating canned beans and silently observing the darkening woods. Jake seemed more at ease, but Richard noticed the boy still glanced nervously at the tree line, as if waiting for something to move out of the shadows. Richard didn't blame him. The forest could be unsettling at night, especially for a kid who was used to the hum of city life. "Let's head inside," Richard suggested, standing up and extinguishing the fire. The darkness felt different now, thicker, almost oppressive. They went inside the cabin and closed the door behind them. The small room, with its only source of light coming from an old kerosene lamp, felt cozy and safe. Richard checked the radio, but there was no sign of any communication from the other towers. "Do you think it's okay out there?" Jake asked as he curled up in bed, still peering out the window. "Everything's fine. We're just far enough out that no one really comes by." "The forest is quiet tonight," Richard reassured him, though he wasn't entirely sure himself. But something felt off. As the hours passed, the silence deepened, becoming heavier. Suddenly, there was a faint noise. At first, Richard thought it was just the wind, but it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It came from below, somewhere near the base of the tower. He stood up, listening carefully, but Jake was already awake, his wide eyes reflecting the dim light. "Dad. Do you hear that?" Jake whispered, gripping the covers tightly. Richard didn't answer. He moved toward the window, squinting into the darkness. The sound, almost like footsteps, was getting closer. It wasn't the wind. Someone, or something, was out there. Richard quickly grabbed the radio. He switched it on, trying to make contact with the nearest tower. There was static, but no response. He tried again. Still nothing. "Maybe it's nothing," he muttered to himself, but the weight of unease pressed against his chest. Then, the radio crackled to life. "Watchtower 3, this is Watchtower 5. Do you copy?" Richard froze. The voice was distorted, but it sounded like the operator from the nearby tower. "Watchtower 5, this is Watchtower 3. Do you have a message?" Richard asked, his voice steady, but his mind raced. Static filled the air again. Then came the chilling reply. "Don't go outside. Not tonight." Before Richard could respond, the radio went silent again. He glanced over at Jake, who was staring at him with wide, fearful eyes. "I don't like this, Dad," Jake said softly, his voice barely a whisper. Richard's stomach churned. The footsteps outside had stopped. There was only silence now, but it was thick and suffocating. "I know, Jake. But we're safe here. Let's just stay inside for now." Richard locked the door and double-checked all the windows. The night stretched on, each minute feeling like an eternity. By morning, the forest was eerily calm. The mist rolled in, covering the ground in a thick blanket of white. It was as if the night had never happened. Richard went to the window and looked out. There was no sign of any footprints or any disturbance near the base of the tower. He felt a strange sense of relief but also an underlying tension that hadn't been there before. Jake was already up, sitting by the window and staring at the mist. "Do you think it was just someone passing by?" Jake asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. "I don't know," Richard replied, his brow furrowed. "But we need to stay alert. Something doesn't feel right." Later that day, while they were eating lunch, there was a sudden knock on the door. It was a heavy, deliberate sound, like someone trying to get their attention. Richard's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't expecting anyone, no one was supposed to be out here. "Stay here, Jake," Richard whispered, his voice tense. He grabbed the rifle that was leaning against the wall and cautiously approached the door. The knock came again, louder this time. Richard opened the door slowly, rifle in hand, but there was no one there. Instead, lying on the doorstep, was a small wooden box, roughly the size of a shoebox, wrapped in brown twine. Richard bent down and picked it up. The box felt heavy, almost ominous in his hands. There was no note, no message, nothing to explain its presence. "Dad, what is it?" Jake asked from behind him. "I don't know," Richard answered, his voice low. "But I have a feeling we're about to find out." As he turned the box over in his hands, he noticed a strange symbol carved into the wood, a spiral, like a maze, twisting inward. His fingers tingled as he traced the symbol. Something in the pit of his stomach told him that whatever was inside the box, it would change everything. Richard stared at the wooden box, still not fully understanding why it was left there. His grip tightened around it, and for a moment, the noise of the forest faded into a dull hum in his ears. "What's in it, Dad?" Jake asked again, his voice trembling slightly as he stepped closer. Richard didn't answer immediately. He glanced down at the box, still unsure whether it was a prank, a gift, or something more unsettling. There was no one else in the forest, and they hadn't seen any signs of other people for days. "Let's open it inside," Richard finally said, trying to sound more reassuring than he felt. He motioned for Jake to follow him back into the cabin. Once inside, Richard set the box on the table, his hands slightly unsteady. He reached for his pocketknife and carefully cut the twine that bound it. As the twine fell away, he could feel the weight of something pressing down, a sense of unease growing. Jake stood by the window, watching the mist swirl around the tower's base, but his eyes kept darting back to his father, who was now lifting the lid of the box. Inside, there was nothing but a stack of old, weathered papers and a small, rusted key. Richard gently picked up the first sheet of paper, which seemed to be a faded map. It looked like a section of the forest, with red X's marking certain spots. The lines of the map were drawn with care, but the paper had aged, yellowed at the edges as if it had been there for years. "What's it a map of?" Jake asked, leaning in closer. Richard studied it for a moment. "It looks like our part of the forest," he said. "But I don't know why there are these marks." He shuffled through the papers, each one revealing more strange, cryptic notes and maps. Some of the writing was too faint to read, but others had been written in bold letters: "Leave before it's too late," and "They're watching." A chill ran down his spine as he read the words. The forest around him suddenly felt far less like a peaceful getaway and more like something foreign, something dangerous. Jake stepped back from the window. "Dad, I don't like this. Can we leave?" Richard swallowed hard. He looked at the key, which was small, rusted, and worn with age, lying at the bottom of the box. "I don't know if we can leave just yet," he muttered to himself. He needed answers, and these papers were the only clue he had. That evening, after Jake had gone to bed, Richard sat by the small lantern, the papers spread out before him on the table. He'd carefully studied each one, but the more he read, the more the sense of dread in the pit of his stomach grew. The map was clear. It marked an area deeper in the forest, a location that was barely a mile from the tower, near a clearing he had never noticed before. He had always thought he knew every inch of the woods, but this map suggested otherwise. And the key, he couldn't stop thinking about it. It seemed to fit with the mystery of the place, as if there was a door somewhere, hidden deep in the forest, that it was meant to open. Richard closed the papers, feeling a sense of finality. Tomorrow, he was going to take Jake and find the spot marked on the map. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever this was, it was drawing him in. The warnings on the papers didn't seem like something to ignore, but he couldn't leave with more questions than answers. The next morning, after a restless night, Richard and Jake packed their gear. Richard brought his rifle, just in case, but he didn't expect trouble. They followed the trail through the dense forest, which was eerily silent, with only the sound of their footsteps and the occasional rustling of leaves. As they got closer to the marked spot, the air seemed to thicken. The trees were packed tightly together, casting long shadows on the ground. Richard felt a strange tension building, but he kept walking, trying to push the feeling aside. Finally, they reached a small clearing in the woods, just as the map had indicated. It was surrounded by thick, ancient-looking trees, their branches twisted in odd shapes. "This is it," Richard said, looking around. The place felt wrong, too quiet, too still. It wasn't like any other part of the forest. Jake pulled at his father's sleeve. "Dad, I don't like it here." Richard knelt down and examined the ground. He found a stone slab partially buried in the dirt. It looked like it had been placed there intentionally, almost as if it was hiding something. Richard knelt down and brushed the dirt away, revealing a small, rusted metal door, just big enough to fit the key. Without a word, Richard reached for the key in his pocket. He inserted it into the lock, his hands shaking slightly. The key turned with an almost satisfying click, and the door creaked open. Inside, there was nothing, just darkness. But Richard could feel something waiting, something unseen. He hesitated for a moment, but then, driven by a force he couldn't explain, he stepped forward. Suddenly, the ground beneath them shook, and a cold, gusty wind swept through the clearing. The trees groaned, and the air seemed to grow heavy with the weight of something ancient. Jake clutched his father's arm. "What's happening?" Richard didn't know the answer, but he knew they were no longer alone. As the wind howled through the clearing, Richard instinctively pulled Jake closer, shielding him with his body. The door creaked ominously, as if protesting its own opening, but Richard couldn't bring himself to close it just yet. The darkness inside the doorway seemed to absorb the surrounding light, as though it was pulling at the very air around them. Richard squinted into the blackness, unable to see what lay beyond. He took a step forward, and Jake tugged on his sleeve, his voice tight with fear. "Dad, don't go in there." Richard turned to face his son, his heart aching at the sight of Jake's fearful expression. He hated that his son was scared, but he couldn't ignore the pull of curiosity, the overwhelming need to understand what was happening in this forest. "We need to find out what's inside, Jake." "I know it's scary, but I won't let anything happen to you," he said, trying to reassure him, though his own voice was filled with uncertainty. Reluctantly, Jake nodded, but he stayed close to his father as they ventured deeper into the clearing. The door behind them closed with a soft thud, and the darkness inside seemed to intensify. As they stepped through the doorway, Richard immediately noticed the temperature drop. The air grew cold, and a heavy silence settled around them. It felt as if the forest itself had gone still, waiting. Inside, there were no walls, just endless blackness. But there was something in the air, a sense that they were being watched. Richard strained his eyes, but nothing was visible, not even a hint of light. He reached for his flashlight but realized it wasn't there. "I forgot the flashlight, didn't I?" Richard muttered, trying to keep the panic from creeping into his voice. He fumbled around in his pockets, but found nothing. It didn't make sense, he had packed it this morning. Jake's voice broke through the growing sense of unease. "Dad. I feel like we shouldn't be here." Richard turned to look at his son, but all he could see was Jake's outline in the dark. "I know, Jake. But we have to find out what this is. Stay close to me." They pressed on, slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air felt oppressive, as if the very atmosphere was closing in around them. Richard couldn't shake the feeling that something was just out of sight, waiting for them to make the wrong move. As they moved further into the dark, Richard suddenly heard a faint noise, a low, almost imperceptible hum. At first, he thought it was his imagination, but then he realized it was coming from the ground, from beneath their feet. It's coming from the ground," Richard whispered, kneeling down and placing his hand on the earth. The hum seemed to resonate through his fingers, vibrating up his arm. "What the hell is that?" Jake stood frozen, his eyes wide with fear. "Dad, I think we should leave." Richard hesitated. The sound was growing louder, and he could feel the ground beneath him shifting. Then, from the corner of his eye, something moved. A shadow, too fast to track, darted between the trees at the edge of the clearing. "Did you see that?" Richard asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake nodded frantically. "Yes, let's go. Now." Before Richard could respond, the air around them seemed to warp, and the ground beneath their feet trembled once again. The hum turned into a sharp, shrill noise, like a warning, and the darkness seemed to tighten, closing in on them. Richard grabbed Jake's hand. "We need to go. Now." They turned and ran, the sounds of their footsteps muffled by the thick fog that had suddenly rolled in. As they raced toward the door, Richard felt a sharp sting in the air, like 1,000 tiny pricks against his skin. He could hear something behind them, something large and moving quickly, but when he turned to look, there was nothing. They reached the door, but it wasn't the same as when they had entered. The door was now warped and twisted, as if it had aged years in just a few moments. Richard threw his shoulder against it, but it wouldn't budge. The air around them felt charged, like a storm was about to break. "Dad! What's happening?" Jake screamed, pulling at his father's arm. Richard could feel the panic rising in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. They were trapped. The clearing felt smaller, the trees seemed to grow closer, and the ominous hum still pulsed beneath their feet. "Hold on," Richard said, his mind racing for a solution. He tried again to push the door open, but it was as if something on the other side was holding it shut. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The hum ceased. The air cleared, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. Richard and Jake stood there, breathless, for a long moment, before Richard dared to look around. The clearing was unchanged, but something had shifted. The trees now felt unfamiliar. The entire forest seemed alien, like it was northwest longer the place they had entered. Richard's heart pounded as he looked at his son. "We need to get out of here, Jake. Now." They turned to leave, but as they made their way back toward the path, Richard noticed something on the ground, something he hadn't seen before. It was a piece of paper, crumpled and half buried in the dirt. He bent down and picked it up, unfolding it carefully. Written on it, in the same faded ink as the map, were the words, "They are watching. Don't come back." Richard's blood ran cold as he crumpled the paper in his hand. He looked at Jake, and without saying a word, they started running again, leaving the clearing, and the dark secrets of the forest, behind them. As they ran, the dense fog cleared, and the forest began to feel less menacing. The hum had stopped, and the eerie sensation of being watched seemed to fade with every step. The door to the clearing was still in the distance, its twisted shape standing as an unsettling reminder of the inexplicable events that had just unfolded. Richard gripped Jake's hand tightly, his breath ragged from the sprint. They had to get out, had to make it back to the car and away from whatever had been lurking in those woods. The path seemed longer now, more treacherous. Their feet stumbled over roots and rocks, and the trees around them, once so familiar, now seemed to close in on them as though guiding them deeper into the forest. The oppressive weight in the air had lifted, but the unease hadn't quite gone away. Richard's mind raced with questions he couldn't answer. "Are we almost there?" Jake asked, his voice trembling. "We're close," Richard said, trying to sound confident. But even as he spoke, doubt gnawed at him. The forest had shifted, and he wasn't sure if they were even heading in the right direction anymore. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Richard's legs burned from the exertion, and the stillness of the trees felt suffocating. The sun had long since disappeared, and all they had was the dim light of the moon cutting through the gaps in the canopy. Finally, they emerged from the trees, and there, in the distance, was their car, an ordinary sight in the midst of the surreal. The sense of safety it brought was almost overwhelming. Richard pulled Jake toward the car, unlocking it with trembling hands. They got inside, and Richard slammed the door shut, starting the engine with a sense of urgency. He didn't look back as he drove away, keeping his eyes fixed on the road, his foot heavy on the gas pedal. The drive back to town was quiet, save for the hum of the engine and the occasional rustling of trees as they passed. The tension between them was thick, but neither father nor son spoke. Richard could feel Jake's eyes on him, but he couldn't find the words to explain what had happened. When they finally reached the outskirts of town, Richard pulled the car over to the side of the road and stopped. He put his head in his hands, his mind racing to make sense of what they had experienced. He knew something had happened in that forest, something that couldn't be easily explained. The sensation of being trapped, the hum from the ground, the shadow they had seen, it all felt too real to be a figment of their imagination. "Dad. What was that?" Jake's voice broke the silence, shaky and filled with fear. Richard exhaled slowly, looking over at his son. He had no answers. No reasonable explanation for what had happened. But he knew one thing for certain, whatever it was, they had narrowly escaped it. I don't know, Richard replied quietly, his voice hoarse. But we're safe now. The weight of the unknown hung in the air as they sat in the car, parked in the dark. There were no more words to say. Both of them had felt it, something unexplainable, something dark and watching, deep in the woods. But they had made it out. Richard started the engine again, and they continued the drive home in silence. They never spoke about the events in the forest again. But from that day on, Richard always made sure to check the map before any trip. And whenever they drove past that road, Jake's eyes would occasionally wander toward the trees, but he never asked about the forest again. The woods, with all their strange happenings, would remain a mystery, and for Richard and Jake, that was all they needed to know. They were safe. And they were leaving it all behind.